to start us off.
Okay, I think we're going to start off with the little word, a little prayer from Ivory, right?
We're
You're going to
going
give
to
us a,
we're going to end in prayer.
oh, we're going to end in prayer.
Yes.
Okay, well, we're already in prayer. Amen. Because
Amen.
Yes.
we're a community that is together after a hard week and a hard day. So let's get right to it. And we have five fabulous panelists this evening. And just to so you know who they are, we've asked each of them, and I will call them by their first name, and we'll ask them to just share a bit about who they are, as well as any affiliations that they want to share with this group in terms of their organizations that they might be affiliated with. So why don't we start with Reverend Ingrid?
Reverend June, I knew you were going to call on me first. I just knew that.
Yes.
Good evening. I'm Reverend Dr. Ingrid Tucker, affectionately known as Ingrid, and I am a pastor of Awakened Christian Church, which is going on 9 years old. We come out of Jubilee. I am also the acting CEO of Madison Park Development Corporation here in Roxbury, which is where I am originally from. I was in education for 30 plus years and decided it was more important for me to give back to a community that I love and make an impact in a way that was immediate. So here I am and glad to be here this evening.
Thank you. And next is Jesse.
Thank you, Reverend June. Yes, my name is Jesse Kanson-Benanav. I am the executive director at Abundant Housing, Massachusetts. We're a statewide pro-housing organization that believes Massachusetts is for everyone, and we're working to open up opportunities in every Massachusetts community for people of all walks of life, and trying to address the housing affordability crisis in our state. I have about almost 25 years experience working in the housing and affordable housing industry here in Massachusetts. I've worked as a community organizer. I've done program support for public housing and Section 8 programs, both in Massachusetts and around the country, and also worked as an affordable housing developer at community development corporations and other nonprofits in the region. I've been in this role leading Abundant Housing in our advocacy and policy work for the last 4 years, since 2021. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight. Look forward to the conversation.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. And then I'm going to jump over to my friend Christine Chase.
Thank you, Reverend June. Hi, I'm Christine Chase. I am a social worker by trade. I used to work at City Mission with Reverend June, and in the last couple of years, I have not been working. I have 4 kids that I have temporary custody of right now that I take care of. So they're my full-time job, along with I do a little bit of stuff with people who have persistent mental illness, and trying to guide them in the directions in which they're looking to kind of make their lives better. I started out as a special educator in Brockton. I did that for a couple of years, and then got married, had my children, went back to school, got my social work degree, got my license, ended up at City Mission, and then have just been doing kind of like little DMH, that kind of stuff since then.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. Davina, are you here? Yes, please introduce yourself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Davina Fry Winston. I'm currently a case manager. I work right now with Pine Street Inn. This is a newer position for me, so I'm really getting to see what the homeless population looks like firsthand in this role. But previously, I would say that I specialize in human services and workforce development. I worked along with Ivy in the past for the Department of Youth Services. So my background was primarily with the youth, and so like the disparities and the concerns that they would face daily in their families. So now this is more of a new role for me, like I said in the beginning, but I'm excited to be here and to talk about the knowledge that I have, and I'm excited to learn more too.
Yes, beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Dr. James Jennings, where
Thank
are you? Tell
Yeah.
us about yourself.
Thank you very much. My name is James Jennings. I'm Professor Emeritus of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning at Tufts University. And over the years, I've worked with a number of community-based organizations. Some representatives are right here on this conversation. I focused on housing, economic development, youth. A few years ago, I was the researcher and writer for the City of Boston's Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Report, which I think has a lot of relevance to our conversation tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, James, very much. Well, we have a fantastic panelists here with a lot of information, lived experience for sure. If you are from the city of Boston and housed, or Cambridge. So let's get started. And Elizabeth, you're going to lead the questioning off.
Yes, I am. Thank you. So first I'm going to start kind of broadly and just ask the panelists that want to weigh in on this, if they can just share with us some of what you see as the most pressing challenges in terms of homelessness, housing availability, and housing affordability in Massachusetts right now. If you could just name a couple things, and if you want to give us a little background on how we got to where we are, that would be great.
Okay. Well, I don't mind starting. Is it okay for me to start? I don't know the protocol.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I have to really express major appreciation to Boston Faith and Justice Network for sponsoring a conversation today, especially in this time, especially on housing justice. Unfortunately, the concept of housing justice is left off the tables, a lot of tables when we talk about housing and affordable housing. And I think this discussion is important for three, at least in my mind, three reasons. One is that the housing crisis that we all acknowledge is real, it's concrete, it's serious. It's not just about supply and demand. And so if we use strategies that only focus on supply and demand, we're not really getting to housing justice. The housing crisis also has to do with speculation, evictions, extremely severe housing cost burdens for a lot of people. All this has to be part of the context. There's some people who use the term the financialization of housing to also raise the same kind of concern. And that is housing not as justice, but really a commodity to be exploited for the benefit of the most wealthy. So I think that's one reason this conversation is very important. I think another reason, which is related to this, is really there's no justification or excuse for overlooking or ignoring a history of housing injustices and impacts on Black communities and other communities of color. And this makes reference to some of your questions. This history includes redlining, urban renewal, racial covenants, predatory lending, credit discrimination, subprime loans, violence, taking of land, the controlling of the movement of Black people. This is history that still has a contemporary face. Today reflects lower home ownership rates by race and ethnicity, severe house cost burdens by race and ethnicity, persistent poverty by race and ethnicity, higher unemployment, especially among Black and Latino youth, and environmental justices. So I think again, this conversation is so timely and so important, and somehow we have to figure out how to get housing justice back on the table as a critical component of responding to our housing crisis. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd love to piggyback off the professor's comments, and I agree 100% wholeheartedly with everything he said, and I would underscore that we absolutely have we have had a failure to build enough homes in Massachusetts for generations. The reality is that here today, in February 10th, 2025, we are about, and the governor just released a whole plan last week that a lot of advocates and others worked on. And they've estimated that we have a shortage. We need to build 222,000 homes in Massachusetts in the next 5 years just to meet the demand for housing that we have today. And it's in part because of all those reasons that the professor mentioned, and we have just utterly failed. Well, I should say that the consequences are exactly what the professor mentioned, and is rooted in the housing injustice we face. We, for generations in Massachusetts, have failed to build homes for people at all income levels in all communities. Statistics are not what move hearts and minds, but they're helpful sometimes. We know that in the 30 years prior to 1990 in Massachusetts, we built about 900,000 new homes. The royal we as a state, and the CDC is doing affordable housing development, market rate development, single family homes, apartments, etc. About 900,000 homes in those 30 years leading up to 1990. In the 30 years since 1990, we have built half as many, just over 450,000 homes in the 30 plus years. And that is at a time where our population has steadily grown. Massachusetts population isn't growing as fast as the Sun Belt or the Southeast, but we are growing. Right. And on top of that, our economy has grown significantly. We've added thousands and thousands of jobs, mostly high-paying jobs for people in academia, tech, biotech, finance, right? The industries that have grown up in Boston and Cambridge over the last 30 years. But we have failed to build enough homes for our existing population as well as for our growing and our new population. And what that means is that we have forced people across the income spectrum to compete with each other for a very limited supply of homes across our region and across our state. And that means that lower income folks are directly having to compete. If they're not lucky enough to win a lottery for affordable housing or a Section 8 voucher, they are having to compete with wealthier folks, biotech workers, etc., for an existing home, maybe a rental unit in a triple decker in Boston or elsewhere. And we know what happens. And when you force a working class family to compete with a biotech executive for a home, who's going to win in that competition? It's going to be the wealthier person. And they are bidding up the cost of housing. And we've created a landlord's market. Landlords do not have to compete for us. We have to compete for housing. And that means the landlord can say, I am going to set my rent really, really high and make it impossible for a working class person to afford. We've seen this for years in Massachusetts, in Boston, and in the home ownership market, where we know that a home can go on the market and there's one weekend of open houses and Monday morning bids are due and there are multiple offers that are $100,000 over asking price in cash. And a working class family trying to enter home ownership simply cannot compete with that. We've also seen that now happen in the rental market. In recent years, we have heard, and the Globe has written about the situation where a landlord will put a rental home on the market and there will be a line out the door. And then you have wealthier renters who are actually offering the landlord above their listed rental price just to secure that unit. And so now we've created a scenario where working families and individuals can't even compete for rental units. One of the reasons we have this is because of the way we as a state have allowed communities across Massachusetts, particularly suburban communities, to utilize zoning to exclude certain types of homes from being built in their borders. If you say nothing but a McMansion on a 2-acre lot can be built in our community, well, the only people who are then going to have access to your community are those who can afford that type of homes. And we know, because of wealth disparities among racial groups in Massachusetts, that's really going to drive segregation within these communities. And that's why we have so many suburban towns where you see, 80, 90% white homeowners. There's no rental stock. There's very little affordable housing, except for that can get through under the 40B law. But communities fight that tooth and nail. So we really need to address how communities use their power over land use and zoning, not just to exclude, but to include and build more inclusive communities and build opportunity in their borders. And I think we've utterly failed to do that. And that's why we're in part in this situation we're in, notwithstanding everything that the professor did say, that we absolutely need to make sure we're not just building, but being very thoughtful about who are we building for. Absolutely agree with that. But really, that power over zoning and land use that we've given to communities has been abused for years.
Well, I'd like to jump in. I think I agree with what you just said, and Dr. Jennings. One thing that we haven't outlined is that there still is a huge racial wealth gap in our city. Boston is one of the highest cost of living places in the country. And so as our rents continue to grow, that racial wealth divide is huge, right? And so what you're seeing is a disproportionately amount of homelessness happening with Black and brown people, some of whom are considered, the chronic homeless who have mental health issues. Some are the families. There are a lot of families, and it's because it's out of reach. It is impossible for them to be able to find something that's affordable in a city that has such a huge gap. And so I think it's also important. I know that that's something that we see on a regular basis. Even in our programs, we see a lot of our youth that come in that are homeless, right? Because they don't have any place to go. And so just looking at homelessness alone, why do people land in that situation? But what are the projects, or what are we doing to actually address the mental health piece? What are we doing to address the youth that don't have homes to go to? I don't think that that's a top priority, and it absolutely should be. But when you're already talking about people who are fighting to get into an apartment and the line is 3 miles long and it goes to the highest bidder, it does come down to supply and demand in some way, because obviously we don't have enough. So I appreciate what you all have said. I am new to this market, but it has been quite the learning experience, having on one side doing the affordable housing, but on the other side doing the programming where we actually have direct contact with the families that are in need, many of whom we are partnered with social services, but it is just out of control. It is out of control. I mean, the homelessness has gone up since 2018, 22%. So that's an issue. That's an issue. But I do attribute a lot of it to the racial wealth gap that continues to grow broader and broader, and we need to pay attention to it.
Can I just add, I'd like to piggyback to you guys. I think you guys are like right on. Like the most of our the majority of homeless are our kids under the age of 18 who are in families. In 2023, 31% of our homeless people were kids under the age of 18. And like you said, the disparities between racial, like 52% of our homeless in the city of Boston, people of color. I kind of have a hard time accepting that. Not only that, but I think I have from a different perspective is like we talk about affordable housing, affordable to whom and for whom is what I say, because if you're talking affordable housing, the way the scales are set up right now, they go by the mean income of wherever you are. So like right now, I was born and raised in Charlestown. So I couldn't even afford to rent an apartment in Charlestown. I'm in Cambridge right now, but even that, people who make $100,000 and less are allowed get subsidies. They can have a subsidy if you make $100,000. Well, me as a single white woman, as a social worker, I am not even going to make close to $100,000. How am I going to compete with that? And that, I think, is the other thing is why don't we, like we took out rent control, we took out, like all these safeguards we had for people, and then didn't put anything in its place, so that the rents now have skyrocketed. No one, unless you're rich, you can't afford it. And so I think that, like, why aren't we tiering the affordability, like, and putting it in, to solve some of it? And I think that that bothers me the most is, like, I don't think that it shouldn't be that way. Like, we shouldn't have our families in shelters or in hotel rooms, or, like kids, not knowing where am I going to sleep tomorrow. That to me is appalling, especially given the wealth that's in this country.
Thank
I know
you.
I spoke already, but I hear what you're saying, Christine, and I think Madison Park has, over the years, for the past 60 years almost, we do have a tier system, right? The challenges, and that can range from some, a family with a huge need or a family with a small need, but I don't think that actually, with the wait list that we have, it's just unbelievable. And it goes back to saying, okay, well, what portion are we able to do? That we're limited, and the more we want to build, the longer it takes for us to get through a development project, right? For whatever reason. So I do agree with you. It would be ideal if we had more places that were available for families who truly need it. Right, who truly need it, and how is that defined? And I think it depends on, depends on who's in the seat and making the decision to provide affordable housing.
Well, I want to move on a bit and circle to a question that I might have the answer to, but I want to hear from you folks. Can anyone elaborate on the historical role that racism has played in housing policy? More recently, I think there was a situation in Milton where the state has a law where, Andrea Campbell wants folks to, in suburban communities, to provide housing near transportation sites. And that particular community really pushed back. And I think they voted it down. There might be some litigation. That's just a small little example. And but I like to hear other ways that you see how racism plays into this crisis that we have.
I don't mind jumping in unless Davina wants to go first.
We'll get back to her.
Okay.
Got you.
Well, just 2 points.
Yeah.
First of all, we cannot forget what Christine just stated in terms of neutral terms, supposedly neutral terms, like affordable housing. When a community group in the city were working to put the assessment of fair housing together, this was a major issue because the 2 queries that you raised, Christine, were critical to getting us to a more platform of housing justice. Affordable to whom, available to whom, and I would add, in the words of Miriam Axel Luthi from Shelter Force, make affordable, but how? and affordable for how long? And until we put some concrete answers to those questions, we're throwing this term affordable housing too loosely to justify the continuing financialization of the housing market. But more directly to your query, June, and people have looked at this, it's not just the history of racism, it's the impacts of that history. As you know, when you look at the redlining maps that were put together in the 1930s, 1935 by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, there were areas that were declared not desirable, stay away. Lo and behold, these were mostly Black areas, Black and brown areas in different parts of the country. Now you fast forward today and you superimpose those same maps, let's say on the city of Boston, and guess what you find? It is in those same areas that you have the major and intense manifestations of racial and today ethnic inequalities and inequities. That's where you find public health challenges. That's where you find bad schools, in quotes. That's where you find people who are not making that much money, struggling to make ends meet. And that's where you find the highest incidence of environmental injustices. So it's not just the history, it's also what is the impact of that history on housing justice today.
It speaks to the legacy of certainly of racism and how it continues. You know, people say, well, we're past that, but we're not. And I see Reverend Ingrid shaking her head.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to pay attention to history, because to know your history is to know yourself. When you go back, as you know, let's begin with the U.S. Constitution in 1788, Article 1, Section 2, that declared that any person who was not free would be counted as 3/5 of a person. That gave states that had slavery congressional representation. In the 3/5 clause, it was to help slave owners, not slaves as people. And then you fast forward and you have the Fifth Amendment, which is to prohibit the federal government from treating citizens unfairly, which was ratified in 1791, 3 years later. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, right? But also in the 13th Amendment, in the second section, empowered Congress to enforce discrimination in 1883, and the Supreme Court rejected it. Right? So you couldn't, in terms of enforcing housing. So, and it wasn't until 102 years later that, you know, that when a Black man, Joseph Lee Jones, from Detroit, tried to buy a home, he and his white wife, Barbara Jo Jones, were denied by a developer, Alfred Mayer, to buy a home. And so you think 102 years of discriminatory practices is deeply embedded in the fabric of our society. You cannot ignore that. It is hard to erase that. It is hard to ignore that. And so to know that history and to know that that was deeply embedded, and it took over a century to actually make it right, if you will, and we're still having the same conversation almost, 60 years later.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, and have we made some progress? Yes, but there are still, you talk about mortgages, the veterans, those who fought in the World War, white veterans were given mortgages where Black veterans were not. And when you talk about home ownership and the ability to create generational wealth, that comes from the ability to do that. If you have home ownership, you can have equity in your home. And so therein lies that racial divide and who could afford to live where. And most times it was Blacks would live in areas that we would consider ghettos, right? And that were very dense, and that they had to rent instead of own. So I want to make sure that we impress upon the importance of history in this, and how it has played a huge part in where we are today.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Who's that? Jesse.
That,
Yes.
yeah.
Go.
Yeah,
Please.
and just to add to both comments. I mean, absolutely. I think that the history to a large degree of suburban expansion of the United States and the development of post World War II suburbs is part and parcel to like racist segregation in the United States. Like the suburban tract housing development that proliferated not just in Massachusetts but around the country since World War II was driven, as Reverend Ingrid was saying, by federal loans that were intended to support white families in gaining home ownership, building wealth that has become intergenerational wealth that Black and brown families just did not have access to legally or as an effective, in access to resources because of the way the system was built. And so I believe strongly that that just the housing system in our country has been rooted in racism, to the point that Professor Jennings made around the redlining maps, and where you look at them today, I did some work a few years ago laying the redlining maps in like Cambridge, Newton, Brookline, and Boston on top of or sort of over like existing zoning maps, and you see particularly in like the Brooklines and Newtons, right, these high opportunity elite suburbs of Boston with direct access to Boston, but decidedly not Boston, that the only areas where you can even build an apartment building today are those areas that the professor mentioned were deemed as not desirable and tended to be the neighborhoods where Black people primarily were living. And so still to this day, we use modern zoning as a way to perpetuate the racist impacts of redlining, and I think we have to deal with that. I mean, I think that's one important thing we need to figure out in this country. The Reverend June, you made the point about Milton. That is the MBTA Communities Act is the state law that requires 177 cities and towns outside of Boston that have MBTA access to zone for multifamily housing. And Milton and a few others have said no to that. They're in violation of the law. And Attorney General Campbell took Milton to court, and the Supreme Judicial Court ruled that they do have an obligation, Milton, to meet this law. And that's really important. But what we have seen in a lot of these communities that are debating how they are going to pass zoning that complies with this law, even if they do it and they don't go the route of Milton, they do what they're supposed to do under the law, we see a lot of explicit and implicit racism, classism, discrimination against families, all rooted in the way that they are talking about that in a lot of communities. Sometimes it's explicit, like we don't want children in our community. We can't handle children, right? Or it's implicit racism, like we are not an urban community like Boston. Now, what do you think they're saying when they say that? I think they're not saying we don't want Black or brown people living here, because they know that that's not okay. They'll just say it in more implicit ways. And so even as communities are debating this important, although not a silver bullet solution to our housing affordability crises, we are seeing the rooted racism come out in public, and it's disturbing.
Well, absolutely. And certainly in other coalitions that I've been engaged with around our new neighbors, and hearing conversations in some suburban communities when those families moved in, well, our school systems can't accommodate, and a lot of that kind of talk. So I think we have to move on to our next question, but I want to get Davida in here a bit. And Davida, you're on the front line working in the shelter, right?
Oh, no. No, I'm working in housing stabilization currently. So Most of
Okay.
we refer to them as tenants, not clients. They have housing. We're just trying to help them maintain their housing, which is not an easy task.
Uh-huh. Do you see more people of color in that situation than you do others, perhaps?
Yes, it's typically people of color, people that struggle with mental health or addiction. That's typically the population that I've been serving.
Right, thank you. Thank you. We have another question, Elizabeth.
We do. We have all the more questions. Thank you all. So this question I am going to specifically target at Reverend Tucker, but I'm going to invite any other panelists who wants to. But at BFJN, as a community of Christians, we believe that our faith animates us to act in regards to all justice issues, and specifically that we're called to engage with housing justice as it affects so many vulnerable and marginalized people. But obviously this is something that a lot of faiths agree on. And so I just wanted to ask you, how do you think our Christian faith calls us to act, or how are ways that you see faith communities partnering and doing the work?
Well, let me first say that Jesus was homeless. As much as people might not want to believe that, he was. He
True.
went from place to place, and wherever he could find a place, he would lay his head. I'm going to read Matthew 25:34 through 45, and then I'll respond. Then the king will say to those on the right, "Come, who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? Truly I say unto you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers and my sisters, you did it unto me." So we have a responsibility as Christians to embody that. That is the word of God. You know, Leviticus 19:18 says, "Love your neighbor as you love yourself." It is incumbent upon us to do all that we can do to help those that have less than we do. And if we're truly living that way as Christians, as many Christians as there are, I think that we wouldn't have the type of numbers that we have. I think that there's a level of comfort that people have, and a level of NIMBYism, you know, not in my backyard, and I see churches do that as well. So it's really, you know, being able to not say the sermon, but to be the sermon. What are you doing in your respective houses of worship, whether you're Christian, Jewish, you know, Buddhist? There's a responsibility that we would help our brothers and our sisters. And what does that help look like? I mean, it you know, it can look like a number of things. I know in our church alone, it's feeding people is important. We're a small organization, a small church, but feeding people, clothing people, those are things that are important to us. And so how do we as a body of faith, not just dividing what religion we are, what sector we practice, it's important that we acknowledge that there's a problem, and how can we collectively and collaboratively do this on a larger scale to make an impact. If we can do it in organizations, you know, such as many of the organizations that are represented here, why can't we do it across the faith-based institutions? And so I know for me, it is so imperative for us to think creatively about, you know, solving the problem instead of being a part of, you know, and being a part of the solution and not a part of the problem. It's complicated. I mean, I wish I could give you, some good advice that you could take and walk away. And I don't have a paradigm of success for this, but what I do have is just a challenge to those who are empowered in their respective houses of worship to think about this as a serious crisis, as it is. It is. Housing insecurity is a crisis. And so how do we tend to, crises? What will it take for us to galvanize one another to really make an impact collectively? And I know that's kind of broad-based. I could spend hours talking about it and the ideas that I have, but I think taking some responsibility to come up with some creative solutions is what I would say as a smaller church.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you calling attention to this thought of collective action too, because I think in addition to the just animating force of our sacred texts, calling us to this is just this idea that we're already communities and how can we as a community leverage that collectivism for action. So yeah, thank you. Do you want to go on to the next question, June? Your microphone. There we go.
For those who have had direct experience and knowledge, can you share some insights from your experience? And what are the most pressing needs that you see for those that are experiencing homelessness? And what are some of the challenges and rewards of your work?
I guess I can go. I haven't talked much.
Thank you.
The first part of the question, can you repeat that? So I can
Sure. If you've had direct experience or knowledge, and can you share some insights from your experience? Day to day experience. I used to be an administrator and did a lot of programming and writing grants, but it wasn't until I got on the ground down at Mass and Cass that I had a story to share, not just about others, but about myself and the work that I feel that God had called me to. So the question is, can you share some of your insights from your experience? And what do you see in working with different groups of people, whether it's kids or maybe sometimes it's with our own families? What do you see some of the challenges and rewards?
Okay, so I would say for me, because I am working with people that are either facing eviction or new to having housing, that I've always thought like this based on how I was raised and just being someone that has faith that anyone can end up where they are. So sometimes I think when you go into this work, you feel like you're in a position where this can never happen to you. And having that mindset is never of God because you're already looking down on these people. So I think one of the things I try to go into every visit or anytime I'm meeting with anyone, I treat them how I would want to be treated, and I treat them like a human, which I can tell is not something that they're often used to because they're looked at as like less fortunate and less than. Some of the challenges could be though, because a lot of the people I work with, like I said, face addiction, have trouble with addiction or mental health. So sometimes we may feel like we want it more for them than they may want it, because sometimes it can be easy, as surprising as it may sound, to be homeless. It may be easier to be homeless than to look for housing because it can be very discouraging. And if this is something that you just keep getting doors shut, after a while, you're like, you know what, maybe this is where I'm supposed to be. And you almost tell yourself that. So half of the battle and the challenge is having people find faith and belief again within themselves that they can do this, that even if they've been homeless for 5+ years, that this doesn't mean this is it for them and this is where their life is going to end. And so I just find that like doing this work can be very rewarding, and it can be very sad too, because you realize, like, I think Jesse mentioned, like there isn't really, it's confusing how we can all be working class, and then there's wealthy people, and then there's local, and we're all like facing in the same challenges. We're all applying to the same houses. So it's just unfair. It's confusing. And since I've only been in this field for 7 months, I've been having a hard time looking for housing myself on like a personal level. So it's been very interesting to hear my tenants complain about what their concerns are. And a lot of them match my concerns, where it's like, yeah, I want a neighborhood that I can raise my daughter in and feel comfortable. They deserve that as well, and they're not getting that. So another challenge I'm seeing is that the housing that they are being offered is not livable. It's, some of the things I've seen is just unbelievable that they're saying this is appropriate housing for a human. And it's like going into those meetings and almost advocating and fighting on behalf of someone that everyone doesn't think is important. So they're like, okay, here she comes again. Yeah, we'll fix the toilet. And then they don't. So that stuff I see every day. I see them like their needs being ignored, even when they do speak up for themselves, even when they do go to housing court and do all the right things. Someone somewhere who doesn't want to be bothered with them is going to find an excuse to be like, we'll give them a 30-day extension, but they need to leave, knowing they have nowhere else to go.
Well, you've brought some important challenges into this conversation in a faith-based context of how we are to be present with one another and bear one another's burdens. And the thing that I hear that you do is bringing hope, because sometimes hope might be a smile, or just as you said, treating someone like they're a human being and not a number and a problem, but that they are a person. So I thank you for that testimony. That's a testimony. So I want to invite Christine Chase into this conversation. I've known Christine for many, many years. We have been on the out with protest signs around housing issues. During COVID, I got out of my bed and went downtown to say some words, and she's always been very faithful to being an advocate. And one of the great things that she says is that nobody wakes up wanting to be homeless. And isn't that true? So, Christine, if you could share your story, it would be
sure. Nobody wakes up wanting to be homeless, and nobody wakes up not wanting to feel like they are less than human. And I think for me, that's a huge thing, is that, like, we have to always keep in mind that we're human beings first and foremost. Like, I don't know. But yeah, I have, it's been a while now, but I was married. I had 4 children that were very young. My husband became addicted to crack cocaine. I asked him to leave. So he left. And we were still trying to work things out, but eventually he did get clean and sober. I was trying to work things out. He didn't want to come back. And as a result, I was left with 4 small children. I had a little part-time job that I worked 8 hours, 8 hours a week. And here I was left. I grew up in a middle-class family. My father was a Boston firefighter. My mom was a nurse. So I knew nothing of the welfare system, housing stuff. Like, I had never experienced any of that. And here I was thrown with, like I said, 4 small kids, thrown in the midst of, okay, now what do I do? My rent got behind. I couldn't pay it. And I kind of lost all hope. I had points in my life where I really felt as though I would be better off dead. My kids would be better off if I weren't around. And so, and that's when I went to City Mission because I had gone to, the other thing is, I think that a lot of people who are in this position don't know what their rights are as tenants, even if they're in the eviction process, because I can remember going to court and the attorneys are intimidating, the judges are intimidating. It's like you said, like, you're less than. And I had worked my whole life. It's not like I was bringing my kids up myself. And I walked in, I had no idea what was going to happen. And they sent you to this little room and go into mediation. And the housing person's his attorney met with you and told me that I had to agree to all this stuff. And if I didn't, then I would have to get out. And so I was by myself and I had no idea what to do. And so what happened is I just signed the paperwork. I knew that there was no way on the face of God's earth that I was ever going to be able to pay them what they wanted, because I didn't have that money coming in. And so I just figured it would buy me a little bit of time to try to figure things out. And things kind of snowballed from there. I mean, like I had my husband who was addicted to drugs. I had three boys with severe mental health things going on. Like that was why I couldn't work. And I didn't know what I was going to do or where I was going to go. And that's when I found City Mission, and they helped me probably worse through one of the darkest points. Like I said, I wanted to commit suicide. I didn't want to be around. I felt like it wasn't worth it. They kind of helped turn things around for me. They like you said, they gave me hope that, like, it's not going to be this way forever. And that's when I really took an interest in, like, one, this is not fair. It's not fair to anybody. Like, how are we, I don't know, how do you expect people to bring up children and not know where they're gonna, like, where am I gonna get food? How am I gonna pay my light bill? Do I pay my light bill? Do I pay my rent? Do I pay half my rent? Do I pay, like, do I get, I'm on the thing. Like, do I have, I'm sorry, they're just laying here. Do I get their meds, or do I, like, I always look at it as a Russian roulette. And so I think it's really difficult and hard for a lot of people. And that's, like, that's where I was, and I always say, like, people, like you said, people look out there, and I always say, most people in the world, in this country and in this state, are only one paycheck away from being homeless. And that's a fact. Like, like, it will take one crisis, one thing to happen that wasn't expected, and then people are like underwater. They can't get out. They don't have the resources to be able to get out. And that's, for me, it's important. One is people need to know where they can go for help. And they need to know what their rights are. What are my rights as a person? What are my rights as a, what can I do? Is there anything I can do? And to know that, one, they're not alone, and two, turn it down. Two, that there's help out there. It's just really difficult to get it. If they're not advertising it on billboards, they're not, saying, hey, you can come here, we'll help you. And the criteria alone for what you have to go through to be able to get the help is the other thing. It's frightening sometimes. So I guess.
Yeah. Thank you, Christine, so much for sharing from your personal experience. That really means a lot. And I think gives us a lot of like a window into understanding some things that we maybe hadn't seen before. And so you sharing your story, that's really powerful. Thank you. And kind of transitioning from that, I want to invite our panelists to share what you see as maybe some concrete steps that we here listening and people who maybe listen to the recording later could take. What are some things we can do personally and collectively? What are some organizations we should be engaging with? If you could say to everybody listening here, like, here's a couple things you could do, what would you advise us to start with?
I'll jump in. We already have, I think, a framework for moving towards housing justice in Boston and Massachusetts and other places. And there's specific policies that should be addressed. we can begin, whether it's in parts of Boston or parts of the suburbs, those of us who see the importance of housing justice and what it means for, as a nexus for the quality of life for everyone, we can begin by uncovering patterns of residential segregation. Jesse made reference to this earlier. So what are what does racial segregation look like here, if it exists at all, or if it doesn't exist? There are a lot of Section 8 discrimination cases that have to be addressed. Landlords have been exposed as being very discriminatory against Section 8 voucher holders, and also source of income. And I think that could be challenged legally. Enhancing tenant protections, strengthening just cause eviction requirements, enforcing, fighting discrimination in the areas of appraisals and mortgage lending. I've been looking at some mortgage lending data for the year 2022, and guess what? Getting back to those redlining maps in places in Boston where those maps are covered, the mortgage denial rates for Blacks are enormously high compared to comparable whites who are not Latino. So I think there are a lot of policy issues that we need to review and work with support organizations that are working on these issues. But more broadly, and this is getting back to the question of, Christian faith. And I can't really speak too much on that, but it did remind me that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the approaches that he emphasized was community organizing, local political mobilization. We have to begin organizing people at a local level, especially in this new time, this new national administration. We have to begin organizing people, beginning with people who see our way, but also talking to people who don't see what we see and convincing them that, we're all in the same boat here. And so we need to figure out what is a political and economic program to move towards housing justice.
Since the professor mentioned policies and listed some very critical ones, I'll add to the conversation. I think we do, again, my focus has been on how we use land in Massachusetts to exclude or include, and how do we really, our goal is to pull back on some of the tools that particularly suburban and rural communities have used to keep out affordable homes and apartments, naturally occurring affordable housing. So my organization has been working on zoning reform as just one piece of the puzzle. Certainly strengthened with some of many of the policies the professor just mentioned, but we do believe strongly that we need to open up opportunity in more places. We cannot allow communities to say you can only build expensive single family homes. You need to allow not just capital A affordable housing, getting to the conversation we had earlier about what is affordable, but break down the barriers to just building homes that end up making homes more expensive. Market rate homes should be more affordable to people. And one of the reasons they're not is because there's so many restrictions that communities put on it, particularly in suburban places. So we have some policies at my organization, Abundant Housing, that we are working for during this legislative session. Our legislature will be working over the next 18 months or 17 months at this point in this current legislative session on a number of the issues that the professor just mentioned and others. And one thing we're working on is just how to use, again, zoning as an opportunity to build more inclusive communities, racially and economically inclusive communities. And I would encourage folks to check out our website, abundanthousingma.org, and you can learn about some of our top policy priorities, including continuing to reform zoning and land use practices, again, to build more inclusive communities. I will also give a shout out to, I saw in the chat, Bill mentioned this concept of YIGB, Yes in God's Backyard, which is sort of a national movement And I know there are a lot of faith-based organizations, community development corporations that have partnered with different churches and synagogues to build housing. This broader YIGB, Yes in God's Backyard effort, is one to give really churches and faith-based institutions the ability to build affordable homes on their properties that they own, without going through the really cumbersome and expensive process for permitting housing. And CHAPA, the Citizens Housing Planning Association, is leading an effort right now and has introduced legislation in the current Massachusetts legislature to do that. I don't know all the details off the top of my head, but essentially, again, it's to give churches, synagogues, mosques, any faith-based institution that owns land in Massachusetts the right to build homes without being shot down by the forces of no and opposition, which are strong in this state. So don't just certainly check us out, abundanthousinggma.org, but check out our partners at CHAPA as well on that bill in particular.
I think I can keep mine pretty simple after Dr. Jennings and Jesse. First of all, people perish from a lack of knowledge, right? And I think that a lot of our challenges are that we just don't know. And so it is important to educate ourselves. Attending, even for me, I've learned a lot. Thank you, Tracy, for sharing the information. And Bill, I think, shared information. But I think making sure that that you want to become aware, you want to know what's going on around you, and the community engagement piece. Are you your brother's and sister's keeper? You bet you bet you are. And so what's that connection in a community engagement process? I happen to, and I'm not proud to say it, but I happen to live in one of those towns that did not, Andrea Campbell had to take it to the Supreme Court. But I know that town was galvanizing people, and just the same way that they galvanized to get what they needed, I think that the same thing needs to happen, in particular in the city of Boston, which is where we see a lot of what happens. So civic engagement is absolutely critical. There's not a week that doesn't go by from an organization standpoint that we are not in the ears of our politicians, our local, reps, Congress people, whomever. We're constantly advocating for, justice, housing justice, and any other justice that we see, or injustice that we see. And really just, that activism piece. I think it's so imperative that we are actively engaged in doing more. And that, I think, sometimes comes by taking one step. Like, what does it look like to do something that can make an impact, and more people that work collectively. And I keep saying that because I think it is a collective effort. The more you have, the better the better impact you can make. And so I'd say research, civic engagement, community engagement, and activism, which I think we've fallen away from to some extent. I'm aging myself now, but I think the generation behind us, the younger generation, they're on fire, and I'd love to see them become more engaged in what's happening around us, because it's a national problem, but it is a global problem. So that's where I land.
I don't want to stop it if Davina or you or Christine have anything you want to add. Not required, but in terms of next steps that you recommend. All right. Okay, so we're going to transition into some Q&A, some questions that we've gotten throughout the night, and Ivy is going to share those. And again, just invite the panelists to answer as you feel like you have something to add.
Yes, so there's a few questions that I wanted to lift up from the chat. The first one is, why are we allowing landlords to charge mortgage prices for apartments? Like, how does that exactly work? And our second question is, can a town or a city take back, say, a golf course or other land and use it for affordable housing?
I'd be happy to answer the second one. Um, in some cases, they certainly can. Cities and towns have um, the power of eminent domain, but that gets complicated. They can do that. We have another resource in Massachusetts, though, the Community Preservation Act, which I don't know the number, some 100 plus, if not more, cities and towns in Massachusetts that have opted into, including Boston, I believe Brookline, Cambridge, many others, where it is essentially an extra fee that's levied on your property taxes, 1, 2, or 3% of your taxes, and it goes to the town or city to use for affordable housing, what they call community housing, open space preservation, and historic preservation. You have to devote at least 10% of the funds to each of those, but then you, the municipality, the city or town, have a choice of what to do with the other 70% of it. Cambridge chooses to devote 80% of what it raises through the Community Preservation Act to affordable housing preservation, and production development, giving it to the community development corporations or the housing authority there. Other cities and towns do the exact opposite and only do the minimum 10%. And the point I actually wanted to get to is that there's been some coverage in the last year about how some communities have actually used their Community Preservation Act to buy things like golf courses and open space that was otherwise going to be used for producing affordable housing. And they used it to purchase that land to stop affordable housing from being built, which I think is devastating. This is absolutely the wrong, not the intended use of that law. So, if you're in a city or a town that has the Community Preservation Act, I would encourage you to advocate for using the vast majority of your funding to support the creation of more affordable homes in your town. If you're in a town that is trying to use it to block affordable housing, make sure your neighbors and your elected officials understand that is not an appropriate use of this law and the funds that are generated. And if you're not in a town that has the Community Preservation Act, it is something that can be adopted through a referendum of voters in that town. I don't want to make the false impression that the Community Preservation Act is a silver bullet. It's a small amount of money that can, be generated often. But getting to the point of the question, that is an opportunity that towns can use to put some funds to help community development corporations, faith-based institutions, et cetera, purchase land that can be used for building more affordable homes. Short of using their power of eminent domain to take golf courses. I tend to believe that particularly municipally owned golf courses, but really any golf course, they're not a great use of land, particularly in urban areas. They're very resource intensive. You spend a lot of money, particularly public money, if it's a public golf course, just to maintain it for the use of a very small number of people. But it's a huge amount of land. Certainly using it for more active recreation is a good amenity for people in that town, but perhaps using some of it for creating affordable homes is, I think, one of the highest and best potential uses for that type of land. So that was a weaving answer to that question, but I hope it's helpful.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to say, one of the things that I came out from my initial conversation with Jesse when we first met was my own ignorance of my town's, all of these laws that he's referencing and the ways in which we zone and different restrictions and how money's allocated. So that was one of my takeaways from our initial conversation. And then I'm like re-having that idea because I'm like, oh, I wrote that down and didn't actually do it. So I would just add that to the next steps idea is just have a better idea of what our own community is. Not that we can't think wider and broader in terms of across Massachusetts and areas near us, but like, let's start at home and understand what our towns are doing for better or worse in terms of the housing crisis. Sorry, Ivy, back to the.
No, this has been a very rich conversation. Other than that first question about mortgage and rental rates, I didn't see any other questions in the chat.
Okay, great. We
Well,
had,
let
we
me-
did,
oh,
oh, go ahead. Yeah.
That first question is really tied into a very, very broad one. And that is, what is the meaning of housing justice for us? What is the meaning of housing justice in our cities and in towns in this country? And that's a major political, perhaps ideological battle that has to be has to be taken on. If I could just read to you an example of how one narrative about housing as a commodity, as speculation, I think it illustrates what we're up against. And this is a quick quote from the Center for Popular Democracy in 2022, quote, "Our nation faces a severe and long-standing shortage of affordable housing for those who need it most, lower income households. But this shortage will not be remedied by market rate construction. Since 2000, the share of construction that is high-end luxury housing has only ballooned. In 2021, investors, not prospective homeowners, investors bought 1 in 7 homes sold in top metropolitan areas nationwide, the most in over 2 decades. They targeted these purchases in majority Black neighborhoods. The corporate stranglehold over all aspects of our housing system is driving our rising and unaffordable housing costs. Meanwhile, renters, and especially renters of color, due to institutionalized exploitation and disadvantage, lack both protections and political power." End of quote. And what that statement means to me is that we have to start holding our governments accountable to this question. We can't let local or state government, and I think Massachusetts may be a little bit ahead of the game, but a little bit, but we have to start holding government accountable to a vision of housing justice that prevents the exploitation of low-income renters and also projects forward decent and truly affordable housing for everyone. We have to have that civic political debate. And that begins to answer the question, how can landlords get away with charging mortgage rates for rental units? Because they are also using housing as a commodity, not as a priority that is fundamental to the quality of life for everyone.
Yeah, thank you. I think we've moved far enough along that I think we won't have time for to do our potential small group time, because we do want to have a few minutes just to close up and suggest some steps. So I'm going to add one question before, but I just wanted to call attention to that. If people do want to stay, I will speak for myself and I'll speak for Ivy and June because I can do that. We'll stay a few minutes. Like if people want to chat, if you're like, hey, I was looking forward to having being able to reflect or whatever. So we'll do that. So that will be reserved for anybody who wants to stay back, but we'll just kind of ask a couple follow-up questions related to specifically what we were just talking about. And some people have put it in the chat too, just this idea of like, we're naming some of these injustices and we're giving resources and organizations that we can potentially connect with. But I guess specifically, I forget who asked it. I'm not going to open the chat again now because I'll get lost in it. But is directing letters to, say, the Attorney General or the Governor's Office, or our own representative or a senator, is there a best practice in terms of, hey, we want to name these for the people in governments? Is there an office or a particular representative that we want to go to first, or is it like any and everybody?
I would start with your local rep. You know, I think that that's a good start. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of galvanizing, you know, those in your community, because when you have more than one voice, it does make an impact. As I indicated previously, that as an organization, we do get on a regular schedule of contacting our local reps, our Congress people. We're in touch with them consistently, because we know how important that communication is in terms of letting them know what our residents, you know, want and need. So I am of the mindset of, you know, grassroots, going back to, you know, back to basics. It does work. It works.
Mhm.
James Jennings ticked off a number of items earlier, and I would like to see this organization write a letter to the Attorney General about the redlining and all the things that he itemized and the proof that he provided, so that she has ways to act.
Yeah, I think that's a great potential next step in terms of just naming the things and you know, calling it to the attention of the people in power. That's really powerful. Yeah, thank you.
Was that something we could do as an organization?
I mean, you mean as like Boston Faith and Justice, our organization?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is. And I think it's an idea that honestly hadn't occurred to me to do it organizationally, but I think there's probably a different kind of power in that. And so that's something we could think about doing. And then I think there's also that power in the individuals represented by the specific people also engaging. Because I think particularly in the legislature, our reps and our senators are more apt to respond to their constituents. But I do think that you're naming something that could also be a powerful tool, maybe for those other levels of government, the governor's office and the AG's office, in terms of, hey, we're an organization, we're connected to a lot of different people, and this is what we're hearing about, this is what we care about, we want you to care about it too. So I think it's a both and, but I would also invite the panelists to speak to that as well.
Well, it seems to me when we contact our senators and representatives, we need to have specific bills in mind, their bill numbers, and their sponsors, their lead sponsors, so that they have a specific way to act, and they can become a co-sponsor. But without specific bill numbers, lead sponsors on those bills, it's very hard for them to act, because there are thousands of bills each year.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think Jesse dropped a specific bill into the chat for us, which we'll again pass along. Feel free to grab it from there, but thank you. But I think you're right as well. The more specificity, the easier it is for them to just act and it be in the moment, as opposed to just a general idea. Well, I think they probably both have their time and place. But yeah, thank you for naming that, Charlotte.
And then we have an old school strategy. You remember the telephone? Get on the phone. You know, I was reading something from Jan Richardson, the woman who puts out that letter every morning. And she was saying how the White House phone has just blown up. They were getting like 40 calls a day. Now they're getting so many they can't even get to over 1,000 calls. I think getting on the phone might work. Not to play games. Here's my phone right here. But to really get on the phone and make some noise and get in these people's ears, you know, and maybe we can get to their heart eventually, and we can get something changed here.
Yep, I love it. June, you might need to do a tutorial for those of us who phone dialing skills have atrophied. But
Okay.
I think you're not wrong. It's probably varies from office to office. Way, way, way back in time, I worked in a congressional office and they had a point system in terms of like how they rated constituents. If they called, that was the most.
Mhm.
And a letter and an email. And so again, I'm sure everybody does it differently, but phone calls were
Yeah.
way
Phone
back
calls.
then, of the most
Mhm.
value. So it could still be true.
I would add also when you're speaking to legislators, it's always, every advocacy group like mine can always give you all the data and the talking points, and that's
Mhm.
fine. Happy to do that. But also, there's no substitute for the power of personal stories, whether you've
Mhm.
experienced homelessness or housing insecurity yourself, or you work with people who do, and you feel comfortable sharing their stories, and you can tie like real world experience to the policy and how
Mhm.
policy will impact that. That's always more powerful because they hear from advocates like us all the time. We can generate tons of emails to them, but actually having face-to-face or telephone conversations and hear from real people actually
Mhm.
gets them to pay attention and not just write off all the
Yeah.
data and talking points.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Jesse. Okay, friends, we have reached our time and we want to honor the time that you've given us and our panelists have given us. I will just add that Boston Faith and Justice, our follow-up step to this, or one of hopefully several, is we'll be having a book group. We're going to read the book When We Walk By starting the end of February. It'll be an online group meeting Tuesday nights. We invite you guys to sign up. It will be a time where we can learn from the text, but also talk in community about what next steps are, what it looks like to engage, what resources we bring to the table, and how we can start catalyzing ourselves and each other towards some collective action. So I think Ivy will put the registration link in the chat, and we'll also send it in our follow-up. And we will send everything that we have that was referenced here tonight. We'll send that to you guys, some of the links and the organization, so that you have that going forward. And we just invite you to engage with us if you have questions, if you have ideas, if you want to continue to talk about this. Boston Faith and Justice is focusing on housing justice this year as our area to sort of dive deeper into and learn alongside our community and collaborate with organizations doing the work throughout the year. So we're looking forward to an ongoing conversation and hopefully finding ways to engage to make a difference. So I want to say thank you to our panelists. You guys were wonderful. We really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, your experience, and your expertise with us so generously. Thank you. And thank you everyone who gave up some of your time. It's one of our most valuable resources. So thank you for engaging with us. Ivy's just going to close us in prayer. And then if you'd like to stay on and chat a little bit, we'll stay for a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to read Isaiah 58, 6-7, which frames a lot of the work that we do at the Boston Faith and Justice Network. From the New King James Version, "Is this not the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, to let the oppressed go free, and that you break every yoke? Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, and that you bring to your house the poor who are cast out? When you see the naked, that you cover him, and not hide yourself from your own flesh." Let us pray. God of liberation, yoke breaker, and justice maker, hear our prayer this evening for all among us who have felt the stress and pain of housing insecurity, of housing injustice. Through their own personal experience, professionalism, education, Lord God, we ask, Father, that you undo the bonds of economic and racial inequality that hold unjust systems together, and shatter the yoke of oppression caused by disproportional allocation of resources, of finances, Lord God. Through your system-shattering word, strengthen those who are on the margins, provide security in these distressing times, support those on the front lines combating housing disparities, and open the hearts of all of us to your need to tend to our brothers and sisters. We ask, Lord, that we take the knowledge that we have gained this evening. We thank you and lift up our panelists, Lord God, that we turn this information that we have gathered into wisdom, to be of those in the harvest that labor for you, turning our compassion into action, that we have practical ways led by your Holy Spirit to make change. This we pray, Lord, lifting all these things up to you, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the first and the last. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Everyone.
Thank you. I'm just, I feel great to have been here.
Thank you.
Thank-
Thank you for having
Thank you,
us.
everyone.
I'm one of